Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. I am your host, Megan, and today I am joined by Dr. Edward Scrivens. I'm sorry, spluttering over
okay, it's a weird name, I understand.
And Dr. Scrivens is an Egyptologist and is here to talk to us about gender and religion in ancient Egypt. So, Dr. Scrivens, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's really, really exciting. I've been admiring what you do from afar for a bit, so it's actually very nice to meet you and to be here in this lovely digital space.
Lovely to have you. So, to start, could you just give the audience an introduction, who you are, where you work, and what your speciality is?
Great. Well, hi, folks. I'm Dr. Edward Scrivens, or Ed is fine to call me, just as long as it's PG-13. You can call me whatever. I am an Egyptologist specializing in the New Kingdom of ancient Egypt, specifically the Ramessid period, which is like 1290 to 1070 BC, that kind of thing. At least that's when my PhD research was. And I currently work at the Egypt Exploration Society, which is a sort of heritage and research organization. So we run excavations in Egypt, we have archives, we have a research library, we run courses and education, all that kind of stuff. But my own background is, in research. I worked on, fortunately for this, gender and religion in ancient Egypt. I specifically looked at the representation of gendered agency in temple and tomb scenes of the Ramessid period, thinking about what goddesses are, what they do, what does this say about how gender and gendered agency was understood in the divine world. And I continue that research now. I'm working on various different projects, which are all sort of tied into gender and religion in different ways, including a book for Liverpool University Press. But if you're listening, I am working on it, I promise. Yes, that's me.
Wonderful. How did you get into Egyptology?
Ooh, well, I think we're kind of going back now really into ancient history. It's one of those things where it's such a cliche answer. I can't really remember the time that I got interested in it. Whenever it was, it happened very early, but was probably facilitated by several things, including the fact that my dad, when he was small, he was taken by his big sister to go and see the exhibition at the British Museum when the Tutankhamun stuff came over in the 70s. Therefore he had the catalogue from that exhibition, like just in the house. And I think I must have gotten interested at some point, and things like that lying around the house really sparked my curiosity. So I read every book I could find. I watched all the documentaries that I could. A healthy amount of interest, of course, from the 1999 classic, The Mummy, and The Prince of Egypt and other such bits of media. But it just sort of kept my interest going. And then in terms of actually getting into it in a more serious or professional way, that really happened sort of by accident. So I was looking at what to do for university. I've always been, as well as academic, I'm also quite involved in performance in different ways. So I perform as a comedian and a drag artist. And so I was always going to do the thespian thing. And then, so I wasn't even thinking about university. And then I saw that you could do Egyptology. I found it in the prospectus and I just went, what? That's amazing. And thought, okay, well, I'll do that. And I'll do it for a few years, get a degree, and then go off to drama school. But then while doing it, I thought this is actually pretty great. And so just stayed in it. And then here I am, then on to PhD, taught at Swansea University for a bit, and now working more in the heritage side of stuff.
Fantastic. Thank you. So we can maybe, if you want to, talk a little bit about your dissertation. What is agency exactly, and how do we explore that when we're looking at things like goddesses?
Yeah, well, that is a big $1 million question. So agency, I think it's one of these terms that people throw around, and we also use it in different ways. It's one of these sorts of phrases that I kind of had to come to a working definition of. So at least in the context of my dissertation, as you were saying, I saw agency essentially as really boiled down someone, or in this case, a goddess's ability to do stuff, like ability to do things and what those things are. And it's sort of the structures that sort of inform that. If we're getting more technical, in the context of what I was looking at, which were visual representations, I was also thinking about agency in a more theoretical kind of informed way. So there's a particular book on the anthropology of art called Art and Agency by Alfred Gell, which was very, it was posthumously published actually, and that was really seminal for the anthropology of art in thinking about art as having agency, as sort of a nexus of agency, if you will. So it's an object, it's a thing, but it causes effects around it, and which I think was a very useful thing for me in terms of thinking agency isn't necessarily just something that people have, it's something that images can have, it's something objects can have. It's eliciting change, or wherein actions and changes happen around you or because of you or through you. And similarly, a lot of influence from anthropology in terms of anthropology of material culture and the sort of archaeology of material culture as well, in this idea that objects have agency, objects are social agents and have lives themselves, which I think is a very particularly potent and interesting thing when we look at Egypt, wherein so often these objects like statues and stuff, they were interacted with and believed to be agents in a very literal sense. So it sort of gelled on very nicely for me. So that's the kind of more complex answer, I guess, boiled down. Yes. So I would say more simply, that the agency of a goddess is her ability to act, or her ability to have changes and effects happening around her or because of her, and the structures that make that happen, and sort of what those changes are. And so that's sort of what I was looking at in terms of, okay, how are they represented? In what context? Who are they with? Are they doing an action alone or with another figure? Are they receiving worship by themselves, as a pair, as a group? And so trying to really create, I even created sort of a typology wherein I would look at these different scenes and try to identify, okay, not only what is happening, but where that agency is located, and whether it is individual, whether it is shared, and what the sort of structures that govern that are. Is all agency created equal? Are there structures and hierarchies within these groups? And spoiler alert, yes, there are structures and hierarchies within the groups, which was a very fascinating process. It was a process that was quite it caused you, again, like, because we've gone on this whole talk now just about that one word, agency. It took means that we sort of had to boil down into what I kind of meant by these terms and how I understood these sources. So as well as just an interesting topic in terms of the content, it also became quite a methodological thing, and thinking about the categories we use for stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. So you already said that you were using tomb decorations and depictions of goddesses to try and get at this this idea of what agency goddesses had. Were there any like general trends that you managed to identify for the Ramessid period?
Yes. So I was using tombs. I was also using temple scenes, and I kind of did that purposefully because I wanted to look at how these scenes worked in different ritual environments, and environments that had different ritual functions, because while there are huge amounts of interplay between these two contexts, and definitely points of similarity with what these settings are doing, there is nonetheless, one could argue, something of a difference between a private tomb. So that's something I was looking at, private tombs. I wasn't looking at royal tombs. And a temple wherein it is dedicated to the worship of that deity specifically, and celebration almost of a perfect created order, as opposed to those elements still being present in a tomb, but serving the purpose of that tomb owner's, regeneration. And what seemed to happen is that there was variation, between those different contexts, and similarities and variations when you sort of looked at where these goddesses related to, or compared them with, rather, human women and their depiction in those same settings, rather in where they're depicted in tombs. In temples, human women aren't depicted as much, really, at all. So in tombs, the first thing I would say as a pattern is that human women and goddesses, the way they are represented, they adhere to vaguely, mostly similar means of sort of representation. They have the same representational vocabularies and rules. It's not like that, it's a completely different thing. So the representation of goddesses follows rules and trends from the representations of elite women. However, among goddesses, there is a decided amount more individual agency, I would say, in terms of these goddesses being depicted on their own, or in sort of more prominent positions, which is not something that you would get with human women in quite that same way. However, you still get that these goddesses are perhaps more prominent, they have more agency, but they nonetheless are usually, that is weighted, and so that gods have more, or gods are more prominent. So goddesses may have prominence, but gods have primacy, you might say, and that is replicated in different, quite often very physical, material ways. So a goddess may be on her own in pride of place, the sole recipient of worship, let's say, in a scene from the tomb owner, but her image in that capacity may be in a less prestigious part of the tomb complex. It may be on a lower sort of surface of the wall or something like that, whereas sort of gods will usually take the more prime locations or will be more numerous. And so that's sort of what I would say. What I would say similarly, to contrast that then with the temple context, is that goddesses appear with individual agency, again, as individual focuses of worship and things, much more frequently in temple contexts where they do appear. And that sounds like a weird thing to say, but mainly what I'm trying to communicate with that is that goddesses can appear many times. For instance, so the thing I'm thinking of is the temple of Abidos, the temple of Seti I at Abidos. And this is a really cool, it's a brilliant temple. If you've never seen it or never been, I really recommend looking at it. It's a gorgeous example of New Kingdom religious architecture. So much of it is so well preserved. And it's almost in the shape of several little temples mushed together, because there are several chapels and each sort of sliver of the temple is dedicated to each chapel. And there is one chapel dedicated to Isis, which is relatively rare, to be honest, because before the Greco-Roman period, you don't really see the goddess Isis having that many of her own sort of dedicated cultic spaces. She's usually absorbed into the cult of Osiris, who was her, her husband and brother, who's the god of the dead, and she very helpfully resurrected him. And she, as you can imagine, in that sanctuary and in the areas associated with that sanctuary, is really prominent. And indeed, goddesses more generally are quite prominent, and you see loads of them, and they are in the scenes of those areas are sole recipients of worship. But what you also don't see is that many gods. So it seems to be that and this is again where there is perhaps similarity between the rules that govern human women and goddesses, though there are nonetheless differences, is that, like human women, the prominence and agency of goddesses seems to largely depend on the absence or less, or a fewer numbers, of male deities who are, let's say, kind of equivalent or higher status of them in gender hierarchies or in kinship hierarchies, because there's a general rule that wives stand behind husbands, really speaking, in these scenes. Wives or women can stand in front of sons, but they don't if it's their husband, if it's their brother, things like that. Then women and female figures usually take secondary positions, and that seems to hold true with goddesses as well. So they can be very prominent, they can be very active, but that tends to necessitate a less or fewer number of the male figures being around, because while if it's that goddess's temple or something, then of course you want her to be prominent, of course you want her to be active and have a focus and a lot of agency. But what you also cannot do is threaten the sort of the primacy or the integrity, I think I even referred to it as like compositional integrity or something, of gods, because they're always depicted active, and you can't do that. And one of the things that I find interesting in Egyptian monumental decoration and architecture in both tombs and temples is the quite complex algebras that almost happen in order to maintain these two things, especially where you have a space where we want to depict this goddess here because she's very important for in terms of a tomb setting, she's very important for rebirth and regeneration, or this is literally her temple. But also you have to maintain that primacy. So you end up then getting sometimes these quite ingenious ways of maintaining those two things at the same time. And I think that's one of the interesting things about such contexts, is that that's where you can really see the mechanisms at work and sort of straining. And that's where it's often when you look towards the edges, I think, or the periphery, that the underlying rules and mechanisms that govern a culture or a worldview or a society in some ways become laid bare just as much as they might be challenged, and because that's where you really have to quite consciously be using them and calculating with them. And I think that comes across in those places. But whilst I'm talking a lot here about goddesses having that secondary position in these hierarchies and all that stuff, something that I argued in my dissertation and that I maintain is that nonetheless that secondary status, in quotes, actually brings with it a lot of possibility. I think that a position on the periphery in kind of these rigid androcentric structures, like if we're talking about Egyptian art and these sort of things, as using the male figure almost as the default male sort of subject, and everything is built around that. So that is obviously very male focused and puts men in pride of place, or male deities in pride of place and central. But what that can also mean is that what they can do is very limited. It's very restricted, right? Because we all have had conversations about things like fragile masculinity and stuff, because being at the core or the center or the focus of that of such worldviews, as a patriarchal or an androcentric worldview, it's not without its price. It's not without its price of entry. Like, you can't just be male, you have to be the right kind, and you have to exhibit in a certain way, because all gender is performative. And so therefore that's why I was talking about this sort of compositional integrity that can't really be threatened, because gods, in order to have the position they're supposed to, they need to be portrayed as active, they need to be in the primary positions, unless of course there are kinship reasons why it's okay for a goddess to be in a primary position in front of them. And so what that therefore means is that while goddesses can be sort of more peripheral to that, there can be more possibility for inventiveness, for play with how they're depicted. I think there's probably, certainly at least how they're represented, which, this is a thing we're thinking about the differences here, possibly between what one thinks and what one represents, but that there can be certainly more fluidity and blending, and that I've certainly seen in terms of how they are visually depicted, how textually they seem to be referred to as well, that there is more scope for this fluidity and this blurring with goddesses than I would argue there is with gods. And I think that that is a direct response, really, or result rather, of their position in those hierarchies and in those structures. So yes, the hierarchies and the structures exist, and I'm certainly not someone who's going to say, no, they're not there, it's all well. They exist, but it's more complicated sometimes, I think, than necessarily they exist, so therefore they are always secondary, or they are completely disempowered or without agency. I think agency and power is a much more porous and flexible and adaptive thing, and we certainly see that with Egyptian goddesses.
Do you, and this might be outside of what you've considered, so feel free to disregard it, but do you then see a similar flexibility with things like the female kings? Are they able to kind of take on that masculine role because they're more peripheral, while a male king wouldn't be able to be maybe a male queen in the same way?
That's a very good point. Again, not something I've considered, but off the top of my head, I would probably argue or say, as I say, so this is just me responding, but I would imagine, I certainly can't see it happening the other way around, in terms of, like a male becoming a queen, so to speak. I think so. And I think part of this is also this is maybe where it comes into this thing of gender, certainly in Egypt, and maybe more broadly speaking too, gender being it's a discourse, right? It's sort of, it's a series of gendered roles and ideas, but that can occur in different combinations and be brought in different ways. And so in the case of female kings, like Hatshepsut and other examples, it is that there is this role of king, and that role of king is masculine, but that doesn't necessarily mean that women can't do it. But then that is the intriguing thing that I think your sort of thought experiment basically has brought to my attention, that I, certainly to my current knowledge, like I say, outside of my scope, but I'm not aware of any examples of it happening the other way around. And I think that's perhaps showing how these things are multidimensional, but they're not always like equally weighted.
They're not equal,
in their directions. So it's sort of like maybe it's like a spaghetti junction. It's like a big interchange of different roads, but that doesn't mean one could go down every road all the time. And that it's sort of that there are directions of travel with these things. No, that's a very interesting point.
Thank you. You also said that the physical position of the goddesses on the tombs in relation to gods, usually subordinate, but can occasionally be placed in front. Is that a mother-son restriction, or do you see other instances as well?
Most of the instances that I've seen are usually kind of mother-son, really, in terms of them being positioned there. There are some instances, and this the example that just comes to my head now is on certain stelae from Deir el-Medina, the workman's village at the West Bank of Thebes. And just from the top of my head, I can think of examples where you see goddesses, or a goddess in particular I'm thinking, standing at the front of a group of figures, and she stood like at the front, and behind her is a male figure and then a female figure, and these are deified, is a deified king and their deified queen. And so that is quite noteworthy because you don't really see, broadly speaking, where you see deities depicted as a group, it is fairly rare for a goddess to come at the front of that group, unless there are things that mitigate that, essentially. And in this instance, I think that there are several potentially mitigating factors. One being that these are deified royalty. And while I don't really see much of a reason to think that deified royals are, seen as any less gods than, anybody else, there's perhaps an argument here that there's something slightly different going on. But also I think there's, in this particular example, so it's a stela that has two mirrored groups of deities at the top of it, with the text underneath, and they're both kind of facing each other, mirror image. And she is this particular one. This is I believe it's even Merit Sega, so she's the local patron goddess essentially of the area, but she is at the front of the group that stands, as you're looking at the stela, on the right. So stand on the right side of the stela facing in to the left. And this is where, again, these ingenious sort of ways of dealing with stuff. So there you have a local goddess, pride of place in this group. However, according to the likes of Gay Robbins, who's done a lot of work on gender in Egyptian art and the functions of that, on such a monument, the prestigious place is to be on the left-hand side of the stela, facing right. So it's the right-facing figures who are the prestigious ones. So, and sure enough, there on that side, it's a group of deities where Amun is at the front, and it's the sort of divine triad of Thebes. And so I think this is an instance where they put this goddess in this pride of place situation, but it's in front of deified royals as opposed to other national gods. Also, it is on the less prestigious side of the stela. So you do see goddesses in those sorts of positions where it slightly perhaps breaks the mother-son kind of kinship connection. But again, it tends to be that these things are some way balanced so that these different priorities are able to coexist within the same monument or even within the same scene.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And I have one more question related to that before we take audience questions. So audience, if you have a question for Ed, please put it in the chat. Make sure you tag me at Digital Hammurabi so I see it. So you've been talking about the physical position of goddesses and gods and deified kings and deified royals. Do you see similar complexities in the placement of mortal kings who are still alive at the time of production and not yet entirely deified, or are they always subservient to the goddesses?
So there's a particularly interesting example of this that I was really hoping would come up. Usually speaking, yes. So kings, whilst being in this interesting kind of hinge point between humans and deities, and they kind of are divine, but then they're also humans, and they're sort of, so where the two,
it's a weird,
it's weird, it's odd. Kind of feels that way sometimes, I think, when we're all going about our lives and we're different things to different people, and we're just sort of a little mix of the two. But there is one particular, again, going all the way back to that temple I spoke about, the temple of Seti I at Abidos. So one of these chapels that I spoke about, I said there's all these different chapels. One of them is dedicated to Seti himself, and with the idea of this being a sort of center for the cult of the king. Whether that was the cult of the king after he died, or whether there was cult going on there while he was alive, that's a slightly different question. I'm not sure actually, I, off the top of my head, know the answer to, but nonetheless, this was his chapel, and it is slightly different. The decoration of it is a bit different. So it's not that he is absolutely putting himself kind of on the same pedestal, so to speak, of these different deities, but he is nonetheless very much, I am in effect a deity here in my thing. And on those other areas associated with that, remember I said that these chapels, the areas associated with them were almost like their own mini temples, like a sliver of the temple was kind of associated with that chapel. And the decoration of those areas tie into that chapel. So the deities depicted there are either images of the god or goddess that is in the chapel, or god or goddesses associated with them. And they follow fairly regular patterns, particularly one wall kind of facing on the other side from the entrance to the chapels. You usually see the king, and it's sort of two scenes. There's like a set of scenes at the top and a set of scenes at the bottom. And on the top, the king is offering to the god that is in the chapel, and on the bottom is another scene of the king offering to the god that's in the chapel. But on the top one, he's usually standing. Yeah, I think he's kneeling down, and the bottom one he's standing up, or something like that. Whereas with the one, that area that's associated with his chapel, there's some interesting flipping about, because he can't offer to himself. You can't show the king sort of there. I mean, Ramessid II did that, but I mean, this was like before then. Like this was still with a little bit of modesty kind of going on. And so what do you kind of do? And what you see there is the king sort of present, but the deities that he is interacting with are goddesses. And not only are they goddesses, but they are goddesses who are associated with the crown in some way. And they are also usually giving something to him, where in all the other scenes he is offering to them. There they are kind of bestowing him with, years of reign or things like that, or the kingly regalia. And his pose in those scenes echoes the poses of gods in the other scenes. And again, so I'm going to actually be writing about this. I think what is happening there is, again, this interesting play, because he couldn't, in that instance, if you take the premise, I can't portray myself worshipping myself, you can't really portray a male deity there, because if he's wanting to center himself as being an important figure, if he puts a god there, that's instantly sort of sucked in, because that sort of primacy they have. And so it's interesting to me that he chose goddesses for that reason. But then I think it's the fact that they are goddesses that makes them able to do that, right? That they are able to serve that dual position of being both divine and both prominent and high status, whilst also not sucking his status away. And also he chose particular forms, like goddesses who are associated with the crown, and the forms of those goddesses that tie into different aspects of his own personality. So his name is Menmatra, I believe, and there are sort of epithets in their kind of titles of these goddesses that tie into that, and his association with Ptah as well. So the kind of flexibility of these goddesses, precisely because they are secondary in the grand scheme of Egyptian hierarchies, is what has allowed this to happen. And that's why I think not only is it really cool and really interesting, but it's why I think it's not as straightforward a question as when we talk about hierarchy and power, that there are those who have it and those who don't. I think it's a more complex question, without wanting to therefore, be like, there is no oppression. There is. But also to say that the picture is more nuanced and complex. And I think the messiness of that is what is interesting. There are no easy answers, but then I don't think we should expect there to be.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. And we have many questions. We probably won't get to them all, so apologies in advance, but we will do our best. First from April, thank you so much for your super chat, April. Is your experience with drag influencing your educational pursuits?
Wow, yeah, that is interesting. I would say it certainly makes me tireder. I was trying to get my dissertation done. I would honestly, to be honest, I would say yes, not in a kind of necessarily explicit way that I absolutely drew it in, but I think in maybe a subconscious way that I was always therefore kind of aware of that performative aspect of gender, and of just the ability to or how certain gender markers are kind of brought in through art, and how you when you're creating an impression of gender or making messages about gender through art, or not necessarily about, but that use gender, how it's interesting how certain things can be brought through, and or like, you know, use like you put a bit of an arched eye here, or you do your face in a certain way, and it creates impressions and creates an understanding. And so what I guess that sort of influenced was more of this idea, not just that gender is performative, but that there are markers that we use for it. It's a communicative discourse between all of us and between these media and the viewer. And so then you get to think, okay, well, what is the message then? How are they getting that message across? And to be honest as well, I think on some level, probably just my experience as an LGBT person probably brought into that as well, in terms of all this stuff that I keep talking about, you know, there being possibility at the periphery, and, you know, agency being something that sometimes people can find even within unequal structures. I suspect if I was to do a bit of, you know, Freudian or whatever psychoanalysis on myself, I'd probably say that that maybe is influential as well, that I'm in circles where we're thinking about that stuff, and where there are people who come into contact with what that means and try to find and navigate that.
Thank you very much. Raphael says, in Latin America, the female saints don't have much differentiation, I assume, between each other. It's more of a locality. In Egypt, were goddesses also very interchangeable, or did they have specific identities?
Great question. I think that interchangeableness, if that's a word, it sort of varies. It varies between, I think, particular goddesses who maybe stand out more and have more defined personalities. It also varies with period, and I think again that is part of this fluidity. So Isis and Hathor are two very they're very distinct, or they're very recognizable deities within the Egyptian pantheon. Both very old, very long attested, and very much have their distinct personalities. However, as time goes by, they come to look very similar in certain instances. And I think that may be a purposeful, or if not purposeful, that is a process of them sort of coming together and being identified with each other, at least in certain contexts. And that is something that, again, I think is purposefully played with, where I've seen a figure that in one caption seems, well, it's a bit of a broken object, but it's on one caption seems to be identified as Hathor, and another seems to be identified as Isis, and it is just the same figure. And while these are both distinct figures, that drawing together of them might be intentionally used. And this is that, again, because you wouldn't see that with a god, really. I don't think. I've not seen that happen. And it's that, you know, possibility that exists within that. But yeah, some of them very much do blur into each other. And again, I think the purposeful use is made for that. So the Uraeus goddess is like several, or the various goddesses can be identified as the Uraeus. So this is the sort of protective goddess who is often shown as a cobra, maybe on the forehead. And different goddesses can be identified with her. And there's a particular ritual text that I looked at, wherein these goddesses are just kind of listed in a big old list in a spell towards the Uraeus. And again, I think this is a sort of an awareness of that fluidity and using it to sort of draw all these influences in at once. So I would say that it's sort of both, that there are goddesses who are very defined and maybe quite unmistakable. And, you know, if you see one, you kind of know who it is. But then there are some who are interchangeable to a degree in terms of they blur into each other, but also these two categories can themselves join. And that happens with time, it happens with context. And I think sort of not only talks about or is a sign of the things that this process does as a sort of social process over time, but also shows in Egypt that kind of ineffability of the divine, really, anyway, that you don't really get god of X, goddess of Y. There is a a constant evolving and a recombining and a changing, and this idea that deities, while we kind of maybe know them for certain things, they are in themselves either limitless or not as limited as we are as people. And so it's sort of, I think, here, this is where the specifics of Egyptian religion with the kind of more general processes of religion and gender as social phenomenon over time, I think that's where these sort of meet a bit.
Thank you. JS wants to know, who was the most important god in Egypt?
Oh,
and then
wow.
you have a list of things.
I'm gonna get all the.
You're gonna get emails afterwards telling you that
I know.
Joe's wrong.
Gosh. Well, exactly. Well, don't like all of the Arton isn't in here. Akhenaten would be furious. So who is the most important god? That is going to depend, again, not only on who you ask and the time and when that happens, but I think that is going to also depend on the context, because, and this is such a humanities answer, but it's going to depend.
Just tell us it's all liminal, we'll be fine.
It's all liminal, you guys. It's whatever. It's the eye of the beholder. No, it's an honest answer is that there are gods who I would say different points were of national importance. And so Atum, hugely important, listed there because he's a creator god in the Heliopolitan account of creation, so the sort of sun-focused account of creation. But then some might say Osiris is the most important because he was, worshipped and accessible by such a wide range of people, and there's clear, evidence just in how much of Osiris related things that we have, that the Osiris's role in ensuring rebirth in the next world was something that was very important to Egyptians. Of course, then you have to bear in mind that if Osiris is the god of the dead, therefore a lot of his stuff is going to be in tombs, and the best preserved things tend to be in tombs. So, you've also got to think about how evidence is stacking up. But what I would say to skirt around this is, as well as kind of thinking about maybe the fact that different gods are more prominent at different times, like Amun, for instance, comes in as the chief state god, sort of, and by the New Kingdom, certainly he's the chief state god, and basically all the way through, is that in Egyptian temples, in the narrative of that temple, that deity who lives there is basically the universal god, or is the creator. So in the texts, they might have creation myths written on the walls that sort of cast that god or goddess as the creator, even if we don't see this myth anywhere else. Also, just through the literal fabric of the building, the way that these temples look and are built. So temples are, broadly speaking, kind of the universe in microcosm. Their architecture evokes the cosmos, their decoration evokes the cosmos, and where the central kind of or rather the inner sanctuary is, where the statue of the deity would have been held, if you look at the building itself almost in cross section, the floor level rises up in like a little hill, and then where the sanctuary is on the top of that hill. And that's because in Egyptian mythology, the first land that existed, that creation happened from, was a hill that rose out of the primeval waters with the creator on it, whoever that creator happened to be. So in the physical fabric of that building, they're creating this reality wherein that deity, whoever they are, is the creator deity, or is the kind of power in the universe. And even if that reality exists in no other temple outside of that temple, for them, that is what the reality is. And that's part of all how Egyptian ritual worked, was creating that reality. And for them, I don't think there was a idea of, we say this, but it's not true. Mm-hmm. It's that within ritual, that is what reality is. That is true. And so, to again kind of skirt that answer, I would say the most important god in Egypt, well, it depends what temple you're in.
Excellent, thank you. And we have one more question. I know there are several more we have not got to yet. I'm very sorry, but I do not want to keep Ed for the next 3 hours. So Bernardo says, what is the broad picture that we have about religious practices among common people? And what kinds of agencies or deities is there in relation to commoners?
Very interesting. Yeah, That's I mean, all things relating to the past, kind of, as you'll well know, that issue and question about common people, non-elite people, is an ongoing one, and one that is always a bit of a headache, because the people who tended to be able to make things that lasted are the elite people who got access to stuff that wouldn't rot away, basically. So it's tricky. But what we do know is that there was religious practice among non-elite people, and this could happen in various different settings. So one such setting being festivals. So if you ever went to or were aware of the Sunken Cities exhibition at the British Museum, that exhibition, which is all about these sunken delta cities like Taunus Heracleon and things, they had objects that were from a very famous and important festival that happened called the Osiris Mysteries, one sort of point at which the statue of Osiris would be brought along down these water channels of the Nile Delta on a boat. And as part of that, people would create little boats themselves and sort of put those in the water. And part of this exhibition was just this huge amount of these different boats. So they would do things like that. We also have sort of evidence of people going to festivals for oracular practice, so where you'd sort of ask the deity. So the more a common thing that would happen with festivals is the statue of the deity would be brought out from the shrine in the temple, and usually on a sort of little shrine in the shape of a boat that they'd carry on poles. And you'd bring it out, and people would write questions for the god or the goddess on little pieces of limestone or little sherds of pottery, things like that. And we know this because we have those things. And they would kind of throw them down. They might, I mean, for all we know, maybe they spoke them, but they probably put them in front of the procession as it was happening. And if the people, the shrine rocked forwards, it was a yes. If it rocked backwards, it was a no. So we know that there was interaction in that way. And we also have, this is a very different context, because now I'm about to talk about Deir al-Medina. So this is the workman's village, I think I've referenced it already, on the west bank of Thebes. This was the community that built the tombs of the Valley of the Kings and Queens. So these were a very specialized community, and in many ways, one might say elite or maybe middle class, perhaps. But you know, these were educated people, probably quite wealthy people. So we can't necessarily take this as a sign, but it's nonetheless one of our best preserved sort of settlement contexts. Mm-hmm. And there we have things like ancestor busts. We have small figures of deities, and we also get this in workers' villages, sites like Amarna, which is the city that Akhenaten built. We have images of deities painted on the walls of domestic residences, and also just the fact that we have people's names, and people's names often were religious statements. We call them theophoric names. So Amenhotep, which is a name that lots of people may have heard, means Amun is pleased. And so lots of people's names are themselves little pieces of evidence of that kind of religious feeling. So yeah, it's harder to see the religious practices of non-elite people, but there are indications that they're there, whether that be from our evidence of festivals, whether that be certain temples that have lots of buried votive material. So perhaps people came and would deposit things. Also, we have some temples would have statues and little shrine areas outside of them, specifically so that people who couldn't go into the temple because they weren't priests or weren't elite enough could go and pray there or something. And some statues are like worn, for instance, in these areas, in these temples, they're like worn away through people just touching them over time for a very long time. And so little snippets like that show us of this religious life, which is probably why I believe Herodotus, when he wrote about Egypt, tricky thing, like in terms of taking Herodotus as a source, but he did say that the Egyptians were a highly, highly religious people, and that there was a lot of popular investment in religion. And in that instance, I don't see.
Honey, I'm on the phone. Go.
to take him back. Or is that your own devotee coming in?
Right? It is. We just got gate crashed by a 4-year-old, a half-naked 4-year-old, which makes it even better.
That makes it better. Look, it happens to the best of us. So don't worry about it.
Well, thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating. And the chat has been wonderful. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for your questions. Ed, thank you for joining us. This was very enjoyable.
And thank you so much for having me. I've had a great time, and thank you for letting me wax lyrical to you about goddesses and religion and gender and all that stuff.
Perfect. It's absolutely perfect. And everyone, if you enjoyed this and you would like more content in the same vein, please hit the subscribe button. We also have an online calendar so you can keep up to date with planned interviews. We've got Kara Cooney coming in a few weeks to talk about the possible Egyptian origins of monotheism, and Israel. So I'm excited about that. And then we have Dr. Jay Christosimo coming to talk about how we know how cuneiform, how Sumerian was pronounced, which is a question we get an awful lot, and I always do a very inadequate job of answering. So the calendar is digitalhammurabi.com/calendar. And until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/digitalhammurabi to see how you can help.